and welcome to this episode of Battling with Business with me, Chris Kitchener.
And me, Gareth.
In this podcast, we explore ideas and concepts around teams and teamwork, leaders and leadership, and all things in between. It's a discussion between a former Royal Marines officer and a product manager from the world of business, comparing and contrasting our experiences as we attempt to work out what makes teams, leaders, and businesses tick.
And this week, Chris, we're delighted to be joined by Larisa Brown. She's an award-winning journalist and the defence editor of The Times. She has years of experience reporting from conflict zones around the world, including Syria, Libya, and Afghanistan. Prior to joining The Times, Larisa was the defence and security editor at the Daily Mail, where she spearheaded the newspaper's much-praised Betrayal of the Brave campaign. It fought for interpreters who helped to fight the Taliban, to be given sanctuary in Britain, and won Campaign of the Year at the British Journalism Awards 2018. Larisa has recently published a book called The Gardener of Lashkar Gah, a book that we'll be discussing today, along with the quite serious content of the book, or subject of the book, which is about the failure of the British government to support the asylum claims of interpreters that worked with British forces, such as myself, in Afghanistan.
So Larisa, look, thank you for joining us. I have to say just at the start, and I know this is a little bit of a podcast cliche, but I really enjoyed the book, and we should say The Gardener of Lashkar Gah is the book available from all good bookshops. As you know, as our listeners know, we try to relate business, leadership, and management in this podcast. But we heard this story, and myself and Gareth went to the Henley Book Festival, which is when we were introduced to you. And then obviously we followed up and read the book, The Gardener of Lashkar Gah. But it was really interesting. Personally, this felt like a story that was actually important to tell as a veteran. Makes me feel old, but as an ex-member of the military, and Gareth as well. But also, I think that there are definitely elements of this that I think are useful for us to take away as leaders, as managers, and as how to do things. So maybe let's go back to the beginning. Larisa, you've written this fantastic book, The Gardener of Lashkar Gah. What started you on the journey to go write this story?
Well, I was leading a campaign that started in 2015, and the campaign was to try and help Afghan interpreters get to Britain. At the time, not that many interpreters were allowed to the UK, and myself and my colleague David Williams, who I was working with at the time, really believed that they deserved to come to Britain. And we were hearing really horrific stories of how interpreters were being shot at, their family members were being killed, they were facing intimidation, death threats on their doors. And this was all as a result of their service with British troops in Afghanistan. And so we started off this campaign, and this went on for years and years and years as we tried to persuade the British government to change their policy on the interpreters. And this sort of all came to a head in August 2021 during the withdrawal, where, when British and American troops were obviously flying those final flights out of the country. And I came across a man named Shaista Gull. He had been the gardener at the main operating base in Lashkar Gah during Britain's involvement. And he had a son called Jamal Barrack, who was an interpreter. And I ended up reaching out to Jamal Barrack because he was really fearful that his father would be caught by the Taliban and killed as they got closer to Lashkar Gah.
How did you sort of start to get involved even in the campaigning? I mean, was it something that you'd reported on? Was it people you'd met? I mean, you talked about meeting with Jamal. How did you sort of start all of that relationship?
I was in Camp Bastion for the final flight out of Helmand Province in 2014. So that's when the British were leaving Helmand Province for the very last time, and they were ending that combat mission in Afghanistan. After that, there was just the security and assistance mission, mainly out of Kabul. So that was my first trip to Afghanistan. And after that, it was just that Afghanistan interpreters were just reaching out to us. They'd heard that we'd written one story about a man named Popal, who was an interpreter that was executed in Iran as he was trying to flee Afghanistan. And then we just had many more contact us, and we felt that we needed to start telling their stories. And then, over the years, there were the most incredible cases, really shocking ones where interpreters had been left abandoned. And when it came to Shaista, who I first started talking to in August 2021, his case just seems so astonishing that I really felt that it needed to, there needed to be a book, really, because his family went through so much as a result of their service with the British that it just needed to be told.
And I think that, to me, as I was reading it, was I had expected to read about the Gardener of Lashkar Gah, but then when you started to tell the stories about each of his family members and extended family members, it's almost each of those as a book in itself. Perhaps you can tell the listeners who maybe haven't read the book yet. Can you tell us what Shaista, and I think that's the correct pronunciation. As I was reading the book, I was thinking, this is dangerous. I'm going to get these pronunciations wrong. But can you talk about what Shaista's role was? Because we'll talk in a minute about Jamal and the role of interpreters, but Shaista wasn't an interpreter. In fact, didn't speak English. So what was his role with the British Army?
Yeah, so Shaista was the gardener at the mob. He'd been employed to basically cultivate a small patch of land and turn it into a garden. And what he created was this beautiful area, an oasis of tranquility is how it was described to me, where soldiers and officers who were serving in the province could go and could sort of escape from the horrors of war. And what I found extraordinary is every single soldier and officer that I've spoken to that's been to the mob, they all remember that garden. And a lot of them also remembered Shaista. And I thought that was quite incredible, because I think if you speak to people outside of the military, nobody's ever heard of the Gardener at Lashkar Gah. And I think that's one of the reasons why I wanted to write the book. And I felt that I read a lot of books about Afghanistan from the point of view of troops, and they've all been, incredible. But I just also wanted to write something that was from the perspective of the Afghans who were there with the Brits at the time. Because their stories are so important, and the repercussions as a result of that time that they served have been quite astonishing. And so that's why I wanted to write the book. And Shaista, I feel, played quite a pivotal role in some people's deployment out there.
Well, I mean, what was interesting to me was there's elements of being very British, which is in the middle of a war zone, employing someone to create a garden. But I think, and maybe this is something for you, Gareth, that practicality of, and we'll come back to the family in a minute, but that practicality of a war in the middle of a foreign country, but that the British military found it important enough to create this little haven. And to your point, and you give lots of examples through the book, everything from individual patrol leaders to, I think Gordon Brown had a photograph taken in there as well, that this is considered important by the military, that they would invest in it. I mean, Gareth, just what was when you were at serving, how did you manage to separate the fighting from life? How did you relax, or how did you sort of what was your equivalent of sitting in the Garden of Lashkar Gah?
Thanks, Chris. It's unfortunate I never managed to get to the garden in Lash. I heard about it, but I was forward deployed into Sangin and then later into a town called Gareth. I think I might have flown into Lashkar Gah in the middle of the night in a helicopter for about 20 minutes, but I didn't get to see the garden, which is a real shame. But it's an incredibly important thing to be able to do, and you've alluded to this, the idea of having those moments of normality in and amongst something that is so alien to normal life. And we've talked previously on the podcast about the management of stress, building resilience in teams, and we've talked about the need to be able to compartmentalize the stresses and pressures of things that are going on around you. One of the things that really, really helps is to have those tiny little aspects of life that feel normal, whether that's a phone call home, whether that's sitting in a garden. And for those people that have never been to Afghanistan and have only probably seen sort of footage of it on the news, especially down in Helmand Province, it's a very arid place, and almost everything is beige. The dust is beige, the ground is beige, the buildings are beige. And so, apart from the green zone running down the Helmand River Valley, there aren't gardens, there aren't areas of lush greenery. So the ability to walk through, something that isn't going to resemble home, but has that kind of feeling of normality, and a calm space from which you can reflect, remember, and sort of gather thoughts is incredibly important. One of the things we did have, though, was we had dogs, working dogs, that were military working dogs that had sort of met the end of their working life as a sniffer dog or whatever, the guard dog or whatever they were doing, that were then used as effectively dogs to pet and cuddle and sort of spend time with, which probably sounds quite odd. You've got hardened warfighters in forward operating bases, but just being able to sit down with a creature that's only going to show you unconditional love and kindness is a really important thing. And I suspect the Gardener of Lashkar Gah provided, a similar kind of mental reprieve to what, other than that, is 24 hours a day is routine admin, fighting, thinking about fighting, and constantly dealing with the continual threat of being severely injured or killed.
And I think you captured that really, really well in the book. And that, to me, the reason why I sort of asked that question of Gareth as a person who was there is it was more than you might think a garden is. You might say, well, a garden, what do I care in a gardener? But actually, fundamentally, and we'll talk about Jamal in a minute, actually, it was really important to the people there.
Well, also, actually, just following on from what Gareth said, for example, one officer took seeds from the flowers that he'd grown in the UK to the garden in Afghanistan. So that was, I suppose, him sort of taking a bit of his home to Afghanistan. So that's, another example of the way that you could sort of cope with those mental difficulties out there.
Yeah, I think there's a sort of poetic tragedy to the fact that another aspect of allowing the garden to be grown in Lashkar Gah was probably a statement about where we, the British, wanted the future of Afghanistan to be. And whilst most of the British military effort in Afghanistan was hunting down the Taliban, providing the security and the space for the rule of law, there was definitely always a linking this to what the future we expected Afghanistan to be and what we were all working towards. And I think there's, as I said, a poetic tragedy to the fact that just didn't happen. And not only that, but the people who were working with us, Shaista Gull, who literally was the gardener, was also then abandoned with the hopes and the dreams of where we wanted Afghanistan to go. It's a deeply difficult subject for me to sort of talk about. And I wasn't in Afghanistan in 2021. I was overseas though, and I watched it unfold, and I still can't get my head around, forgetting the strategic failure, forgetting the decisions to actually withdraw, the lack of linking what we'd done there tactically on the ground and the people we'd done it with to the decisions we made in the withdrawal, the lack of empathy and the lack of sort of recognition of the contribution that the Afghan people had made. It's personally very, very difficult for me to come to terms with. And I found reading your book, and I haven't fully read it, I haven't had time, and I will continue to do so, but reading it, I found deeply frustrating. And firstly, I want to say, kudos to you for fighting this campaign and really helping to bring this to the attention of the British people. But how did that happen? How did the British government, who I don't think this is a deliberate strategy of they were always going to abandon these people. And I also don't think they're bad people, and certainly not as a collective group. So how does it get to a point where we make such terrible decisions as we realized that we were going to have to withdraw?
In 2014 or 2020, or both?
Both, really. Yeah, I
Both,
mean,
yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. I mean, in 2014, and this was the problem, is that they came up with these two policies, and one of the policies said that if you were an interpreter that had served at least a year in Helmand Province on an arbitrary date in 2012, then you could come to the UK. And the second policy said, well, you'll have to prove that you've been intimidated to be able to come to Britain. That intimidation policy was just unfit for purpose. It never worked. They never believed any of the evidence that they were given, and they never accepted anyone. The first scheme, interpreters did come to the UK under that, but it was just such a narrow criteria. It was just ridiculous. And there obviously just wasn't the political appetite to bring these people here. And perhaps, in fairness as well, in 2014, the interpreters and the other workers, chefs, mechanics, labourers, all the other locally employed staff, perhaps weren't facing as extreme threats, maybe in 2014, as they did later on when the Taliban were taking over more of the territory in Afghanistan. But then over time, it became really quite clear that these people were at risk and that they were being targeted deliberately because they were classed as the infidels. They were the spies, the eyes and the ears of the British forces. And that's one of the things that we tried to get across in our stories. We tried to show that they were being targeted deliberately. And, minister after minister just ignored us. And civil servants didn't do much about it. And eventually, when Ben Wallace came in, actually, as Defence Secretary, he was a former soldier. He was in the Scots Guards. He had served overseas before, and I think he really realised the value of interpreters. And he just had a different attitude. He did want to do something about it, and actually he did change the policy a couple of times to allow more interpreters in, but also to widen the criteria so others could come in. And it was under that policy eventually that actually Shaista managed to get in, but he was originally rejected to come to the UK.
Okay, it's probably worth explaining for our listeners what the role of an interpreter in Afghanistan was.
Well, let's do that with Jamal. So I've mentioned the name Jamal. So to Larisa, perhaps you can sort of give a quick introduction to Jamal. I think it's worth talking about his age as well. And then that leads us neatly into sort of what the role was. So who's Jamal and how does he play a part in the book? Yeah,
so Jamal Barak is Shaista's son. And when he first saw American troops in Afghanistan, he was just desperate to join in some way. He was desperate to learn English. And he, tried to become an interpreter. He was turned down originally because he was too young. And then he had another go. And this time he lied about his age. He was either 16 or 17 at the time, and he was accepted. So he ended up on the front line within a few weeks. He didn't have any training. He was shot at, and he then ended up in a different job in Lashkar Gah for a few years, working with the police. And he liked the role as an interpreter. He really enjoyed it, but it wasn't without risk. And Jamal and other interpreters I spoke to that Jamal had known, or other interpreters I just ended up coming into contact through the campaign, would tell me of all the letters that they'd receive of people chasing them in the streets on motorbikes, and it was a dangerous job for them. But of course, it was also they get paid a good salary, so it was a lot of people signed up, not just for the money, but also because they thought by signing up to the military, they were helping Afghanistan become a safer place and a more prosperous country. But of course, that never turns out like they'd hoped.
All of the interpreters I worked with were motivated by belief in the rule of law and the mission that the coalition were undertaking in Afghanistan alongside the Afghan government. Of course, money is important, and like I say, that they were well paid. But the role itself is interesting. They're interpreters, not translators. So they speak the various languages of Afghanistan, mostly Pashto or Dari. But they were there also as cultural advisors and interpreting the nuances of conversation with whoever the British or American or whichever force they were working for, whatever conversations were being had. Now, that quite often would be going out on patrol with combat forces and having conversations with local Afghans in the streets and villages of Helmand. And, as a result of that, they are with frontline combat forces and are at the same risk, if not greater risk, than our combat troops. IEDs, ambushes. On top of that, depending on where they were in Afghanistan, would depend on, quite often they would then go home to their families. And their families are also then at risk as well. So there's an increased risk on top of just the risk of going out on patrol with combat forces. And I'm not sure that's necessarily fully understood by the public at large.
Yeah, and also what the army did try to do is employ interpreters from further afield and then bring them to the place where they were operating, so they wouldn't be recognised. But actually, in the case of Shaista, for example, as the gardener, he was going from his home just around the corner to the base every day. The locals knew who he was. The locals knew he was working with the British, and they recognised him. And years later, that became one of the big problems, actually. And also in the case of Jamal, he was going in and out of the local bases, the police station, etc. So again, he was also recognised. And Gareth, you were just talking about interpreters being, out on the front line. One of the problems in the early days was that they weren't given the same body armour as the troops. So they were, if they were targeted, then they'd be dead. So that was just also so terrible. And that was changed later on, but only after an interpreter actually campaigned for them to get the same quality of body armor.
Yeah, I remember being out there in 2007 and being really quite shocked that body armor that we decided wasn't fit for purpose was being issued to the local employees, particularly the interpreters. The helmets and the body armors they had, they were unarmed, and yet they were always next to the troop officer, the troop sergeant. They carried what were called ICOM scanners. The Taliban and various other insurgent forces in Afghanistan would talk to each other on VHF radios in the clear, so unencrypted, which just meant any kind of radio scanner would be able to pick up on those conversations. So the interpreters would carry these ICOM scanners and listen to the conversations that were being had and then tell us what was going on. So we would in advance know whether we were being observed, whether we were about to walk into an ambush or whatever it was. But that meant that they were really visible because they were the Afghan face amongst the British troops, standing next to the officer, carrying a very distinctive piece of equipment, and they were wearing different protective clothing that not only was less protective, but also highlighted who they were. And I remember being completely dumbfounded by this back in 2007. And like you say, it didn't change for several years. And I think that kind of probably gives us a sense of the institutional arrogance and the fact that we didn't treat these people the same way we treated ourselves, which I think is probably the seeds of the problem that grew into abandoning them later on. And I think we have to collectively, as a military and as a political system, sort of really take stock of the fact that we probably saw ourselves as sacrificing, our own safety to go over to Afghanistan and the various other places where we operate to try and help out. We kind of give ourselves a status of, it's almost the hero status of us going to rescue them, and not really recognizing right from the beginning that they're putting as much on the line, if not more, than we are. And I think if there's any lessons we can take from this going forward as a military, forgetting the political decisions for the moment, we have to start treating people the way that we want to be treated, treating people the same way that we treat our own people. Because I think right from the off, we were setting the conditions for this to happen.
So there was also a problem with covering up faces. So a lot of the interpreters were obviously used for quite high level interviews or interrogations of prisoners, and they didn't think to wear scarves to cover their face, because they thought, well, this prisoner will be locked away for the next few decades, and we'll be in a completely different Afghanistan. And obviously, when we pulled out, that wasn't the case, and suddenly these interpreters had their faces exposed to senior Taliban operatives that were now, running free.
We need to take a short break now. We'll be right back.
You give a really good example in the book, and I'll get the facts slightly wrong, but an interpreter was called by his real name, I think by a British Army officer, who then came, and I think this was on record, it was being recorded or something, and the British Army officer came back afterwards and apologized because use of his real name in itself was highly dangerous. But isn't that interesting? I think people reading this will think, well, if you're in the military, bad things can happen. But what your book tells really well is that was the least of their problems, in a sense. The idea that you would go onto a battlefield and you might be shot or killed by an IED, which happened, and you talk about that a number of cases. But as I read the book, I think I became more and more horrified by the knock-on effects. So you talk about Jamal in the book, and actually, I'm not going to give you a spoiler alert, but go read the book and you'll see how everyone does at the end. But we've got Shaista, who's the father. We've got Jamal, who's one of the sons, but we actually have other members of the family, the wives and the other sons. But perhaps you can talk a bit about Mahood. And I don't know whether I got that pronounced his name correctly, but he had a shocking time, including when Shaista was leaving, whether or not he came. Perhaps you can talk a bit about Mahood, because I think it's this example of this knock-on effect, not just of whether you served as an interpreter, but actually there were lots of other reasons you could be implicated.
Yeah, so this was Mahmood, one of his other sons, and he had been shot at. He'd been left disabled. He really struggled to walk at all, and he had acted as an interpreter like Jamal, but he wasn't employed directly by the British Army. He was employed by a contractor. So that meant he didn't qualify for sanctuary in Britain. And his story was really heart-wrenching, because Shaista finally gets accepted for sanctuary in the UK with his wife and his younger sons, but Mahmood was just over 18, and so he was the only son not to qualify for a visa, because he wasn't considered a dependent. And so the night that Shaista finds out that he can come to the UK is kind of like a bittersweet moment, because he's obviously really happy for himself and his wife and his other sons. But Mahmood is absolutely devastated because he isn't on the list. And Shaista has to make this decision whether to leave him behind or go and try and get on a flight. And in the end, he does decide to go and try and leave for the sake of his other sons, and also he was the one that was most at risk. But it's a lot of the Afghans I spoke to were having to make decisions like this all the time, because they couldn't take everyone with them, and the British government was being really strict with the criteria. And Mahmood, the story there is a happy ending for Mahmood, thankfully, but not all of the family members got out.
So when you've spoken, I'm imagining that as part of the campaign, you've spoken to people in the British government about this. How are you seeing that change even towards today? Because I can't quote the numbers off the top of my head, but my understanding is that we've actually brought over a very small percentage of the interpreters and people who we might otherwise support because of their involvement. How many people, in inverted commas, have we left behind? And how is that attitude changing in the government, or is it not changing? And I say that because I've heard regularly on Question Time, we have this program to bring people back from Afghanistan, but that was really jarring when I read the book, and it felt like there's two different truths. both can't be true. So how's that changing, and what's your sense on that?
So it was really difficult to get people out in the earlier years. So, 2015, 16, 17, 18. And then Wallace came in, he did obviously expand the criteria, more interpreters came, but not enough. And then as it came up to the withdrawal date of August 2021, the government was trying to get more people out of Afghanistan. They realised that actually these people could be, imprisoned or killed in a matter of weeks. And now in the latest figures from August were that there's about 400 eligible Afghans still in Afghanistan. Now that means that those people have qualified for sanctuary in the UK, but they haven't yet got out of the country. And then in August, there are also 2,000 of those people stuck in hotels in Pakistan. So it's still a really significant number, but I mean, tens of thousands of people applied for sanctuary in the UK. It's impossible to know how many of those were the interpreters that have not been deemed eligible and are still, face no prospect at all of coming to Britain. I did speak to one recently who did just manage to cross over the border into Pakistan, and he said that he knew of somebody else that hadn't been told that he could come across. So there are interpreters still in Afghanistan, and it's getting really hard to get into Pakistan. And now there's a new rule that the Pakistani government's brought in that says that if you've not got a visa, then foreign nationals have to go home. So it's going to get harder and harder to get these people to Britain as the time goes on.
Whilst the figures like 2,000 and another 10,000, based on the fact that for each individual and their families, they are at personal risk, that is a very, very large number. But in the grand scheme of immigration, this is a tiny, tiny figure. And so the fact that we're making it difficult based on what I interpret to be more of a political statement rather than the cost to the nation. Do you think that's a fair assessment?
Yeah, I think some of the cases are ludicrous. So, for example, I wrote about a case in the book and followed up on that case a few weeks ago in the Times, where an interpreter and his wife were living in Britain, and their 3-year-old son was rejected. The UK government said that because the dad wasn't earning enough money as a taxi driver, he couldn't financially support the 3-year-old, so he couldn't come to Britain. The 3-year-old has been without his parents for 2 years. He's forgetting who his mum and dad are and thinks his grandparents are his mum and dad. And that case was just utterly astonishing. And since we highlighted the case, he's now been told that his boy can come, which of course is the right decision. Now, obviously, politically, it's a tricky one at the moment, more generally, because there aren't enough houses. They don't know where to accommodate all of these people, and of course there's lots of people coming illegally on the boats, and the policy of the government was to not allow any more to come from the Pakistan hotels because there wasn't enough room for them in Britain. But I mean, this problem could just go on forever, and these people have been told they can come to Britain. They're waiting in a hotel. Some of them have been there for over a year. Their children aren't going to school. They're actually in Pakistan technically illegally. And we've got a moral duty to help these people, and you can't abandon them at this stage, and they've just got to get on with it. And there just has to be a solution.
It sounds like something that happened multiple. I think that's a really interesting point. In the book, you talk about multiple people who have taken matters into their own hands and effectively said, I'm using my words very carefully, safe route out of Afghanistan. And so I think you talk about a number of these interpreters who paid smugglers to get them to the United Kingdom. And that just strikes me. I think that serves to prove your point, which is if there was a clear and safe route, people wouldn't have to do this. And these are people who are used to hardship and who are used to danger and putting themselves in danger. So for those people to choose to be smuggled across the country at great personal expense, I think that actually shows how difficult the situation is for all of those people as well.
Yeah, well, over the years, we've spoken to interpreters who have ended up in, places like Calais in the jungle, in other third countries because they've been rejected for sanctuary. And they've been so fearful of their lives in Afghanistan that they've had no choice but to leave and pay smugglers, as you say. And then later on, actually, and when they change the criteria, they've then found, oh, actually, I am eligible. But then to get to the UK at that stage, once they've already arrived somewhere like Greece, has been much, much harder. And I've just been shocked so many times over the last few years over the various policies on this.
So in this podcast, we quite often talk about the link between individual decisions and wider strategic sort of criteria, and the link between having a collective vision and the actions that individuals across an organization take. When I read your book, when I read articles about the challenges that interpreters and the various other local nationals that worked for the security forces throughout 2 decades in Afghanistan, I get a deep sense that this is right and wrong. This is really clear that at a very local level and an individual level, these are things that we should be doing. How does it get to a point where the policy at a sort of general level is so out of kilter with things that at an individual level are so clearly questions of right and wrong, and as you say, there's a moral imperative to this?
Yeah, this is a question that I used to ask because I could never understand why the government would not budge on the issue. We had so many veterans and serving soldiers as well that were supportive of our campaign to help interpreters. It just seemed like a complete no-brainer to me. And we had this petition that was signed by thousands of people. The public were on side. And it was the Daily Mail that I was doing the campaign with. Then I later moved to the Times, and for the Daily Mail also to really be pushing for interpreters to come here was quite a thing in itself. And I just thought, if the ministers are going to change the policy, like, why would they not look at it? There's just huge support for this because members of the public felt that it was a duty, it was our moral duty, and I just couldn't believe that it was just so difficult to get it changed in the first few years. It was just ridiculous. So yeah, I cannot understand it. I can't understand it.
It seems, but I think you're sort of touching on something really interesting, which is both of you. I would struggle to see anyone in the UK across the political spectrum that would not be willing to say these people put themselves on the line and are in grave danger, and therefore we should support them and bring them back. And even there are a number of people who think that immigration is a problem. To your point, both they tick the box in terms of loyalty to the crown, and they tick the box in terms of it's not 100,000 or 1 million or whatever the number might be. But there's something. Have we created an environment where we can't even talk about this? Because you're either on the side of we don't want people coming to this country, or we do, and there's no middle ground, because this would seem to be the ideal middle ground where people could come together and say, we might disagree more broadly about the strategy, but actually in this case we can agree. But it almost feels like it's such toxic territory for people to come towards that we'd rather run away from it. I don't know. I mean, you're close to this, and I guess you get to speak to some of these policymakers, Larisa. And also just because your readership, both at the Mail and the Times, what's your take on this? Why is it this is such a difficult topic when it shouldn't be?
Yeah, I just never really got it. So, for example, you'd write a story about an interpreter for the Daily Mail, and the readers' comments were what you'd sort of expect them to be. They felt that these people were deserving of a life in Britain, and there was no real question about that. The same at the Times, really. Again, people feel that we have a duty to these people. I've heard stories from like the mothers of soldiers that have died out in Afghanistan that had been told by their sons how valuable the interpreters were, and then they'd really supported the idea that they should be here. And so I could never really fully understand why it was so difficult to get the policy changed over so many years. And more recently, of course, there's been a lot in the news about people coming on, illegally on the boats, and there not being enough room. And so perhaps I would argue that actually it's been harder recently to get people supportive of bringing more over, because obviously we've got a lot of people coming from Ukraine as well. And there's this sort of idea that you can't really help everyone. And actually, when I write stories that happen to be about an interpreter's family, for example, so not just the interpreter, but of course there's risks to their family members. When I start to go into sort of the family member issues, then I think that the public perception changes slightly, because then it's like, well, how long will the list go? How long could it be? You could end up bringing lots and lots of people. So it's a really, really tricky subject. But generally, I have found that the public have been really supportive of the campaign overall, and certain ministers have.
It touches so interestingly on this point, though, of loyalty. And, we talk about individual teams, but I think this is one of those things that stretches, which is, and I think you make this point in the book, which is, to some degree, there are people around the world who will participate in future conflicts, who will have the choice to support the British Army or not support the British Army or the British government. And loyalty matters, and people remember loyalty. And so I think that's true whether you are a government organization, a military, or an individual team. It feels like this is perhaps an extreme version of that, but it really matters. Do what you say you are going to do. Be consistent, be empathetic. And I think there's another piece here as well. And you talked about Ben Wallace, and I can't remember the phrase you used in the book, which was sort of more the human approach, rather than it being there's a rule set. Let's be these things so important, yet it's so easy to forget those. And that the statement, and I there's a risk this sort of almost gets a little bit political. The statement you made was, the readers talk about, well, if you let family members, how many will come? And I think that's the theoretical. Well, that's fine. Let's just talk about these three people. Let's just never mind whether there's 1,000 of them. We'll get to that. Let's talk about these three people. Look them in the eye. Should these three people be able to come to the United Kingdom? Because we've sort of almost skimmed over this. You talked about intimidation, and I apologize, I keep saying in your book. Go read the book. This is a book you should absolutely read. But we're not talking about going down into your local village and having some local yobbos shouting at you. Intimidation means they come banging at the door and say, we know who you are and we will kill you unless you leave. Mahmoud, I think I've got this right. The intimidation was, they banged on his door and they dragged him to jail and then tortured him in jail. So I think there's this element of loyalty matters. It is not a badge. It is not a thing you write about in great hero stories, whether you're the smallest team or you're this large organization. Do the right thing by your people and they will look after you, because the next time, if in 20 years we happen to go back to Afghanistan, there'll be people going, I remember what happened the last time. Good luck. I'm not willing to put myself in that danger.
Yeah. Well, I mean, one of the arguments that the government made for so long, the UK government, was that they didn't want to bring the interpreters out of Afghanistan back then because there'd be a brain drain. And the argument that then the politicians and we were making as campaigners was that, well, you're not going to have any of them left because they're all going to be dead, because they're just having to move from place to place all of the time, and they're not going to survive if you don't get them out. And you're absolutely right that a lot of politicians as well that made the point, politicians that were supportive of the campaign, that if you don't help these people, then when you go into the next war, exactly as you said, Chris, you're not going to have anyone there to support you. And these interpreters are absolutely crucial. You can't carry out a war without them.
I think it goes beyond interpreters as well, and I think you kind of allude to this, which is the knock-on consequences of eroding trust in what we do, and foreign policy and overseas intervention operations are always mired in controversy. There's always different interpretations of the law, of what's right and wrong. And ultimately, at the very blunt end, once it becomes a military intervention, we're talking about the use of lethal force. And rightly, there has to be public debate and discourse around where we do that and how we do that. But equally, what's also absolutely crucial is that the international community sees us as being on the right side. We have to stand up for the values that we believe in. And what I think is so tragic about this whole situation, apart from the tragedy of the individual cases, because of course that is also heartbreaking, but the bigger tragedy is the erosion of our influence and trust around the world as an organization, as a nation, and as a culture that stands up for what we believe in and what's right. And I don't think the politicians who are making these decisions are thinking strategically about the long-term impacts. And I think part of it is the nature of our political system, that they're thinking about, the next election or the next manifesto or whatever the short-termist thing is that is in front of them. But there are going to be significant knock-on effects that mean that this story is, only just beginning, I think. And where we go in the world and what we do is really, really important. And yeah, I just think this is such a massive own goal, let alone the individual tragedy and the moral imperative to help people that we've depended on. I think we've also damaged our own credibility and our own ability to influence.
Yeah, I agree.
Well, look, it's been a fascinating and somewhat depressing conversation. But Larisa, thank you ever so much for your time. And thank you for everything you do for what is such an important cause. For our listeners, if you haven't already got the book, then please go out and read it, because as Larisa said, there are lots of books about Afghanistan written from the perspective of global leaders in geopolitics. There are lots of books about Afghanistan talking about the individual actions and small team actions of soldiers in combat. But there are very, very few books that tell the stories of the people that really, really mattered in the Afghan campaign, and that was the Afghans themselves. And this book exposes some hard truths about the way that we operate as a nation, the way that we've operated in the specific cases of those people that depended on us. And I think Larisa's book really brings that to life by telling very, very personal stories. And I couldn't recommend it more. So
yeah, I 100% agree. And actually, I'm going to challenge you. While the conversation we might have had, in a sense, focused on the negative things, I think one of the things about the book, while it is harrowing at times, actually, ultimately, there is an uplifting story. And in fact, there are multiple uplifting stories. The man whose passion and joy is to create gardens, that's his joy, that's uplifting. The young man who wants to do the right thing and finding his way in the world and manages to get back to the UK with his wife. And fundamentally, while I'm not necessarily, and I don't want to spoil sort of the ending of the book and the summary, but while I don't think it's fair to say it's all perfect, actually, I think there are some good news stories at the end, specifically around the family. So I would echo everything Gareth said. Well worth reading. In fact, I think more than well worth reading, important to read, because I think it reminds us all, whether we be citizens of the United Kingdom or whether we be people who are trying to learn how to do the right thing with our people and teams, this is a great book to read. So after all of that, thank you, Larisa, and thank you for writing the book as well. It's been a real pleasure talking to you as well.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Wonderful. So once again, the book is called The Gardener of Lashkar Gah, The Afghans Who Risked Everything to Fight the Taliban, by Larisa Brown. You've been listening to Battling with Business with me, Gareth Tennant, and with Chris Kitchener. If you've enjoyed this podcast, then please consider subscribing, and please consider telling your friends and family If you want to get in touch with us, if you've got comments or questions, we're available on email at battlingwithbusiness@gmail.com or on the platform previously known as Twitter, X, at battlingwithbiz, that's biz with a Z. But that's all for now. Okay, thanks very much. Bye-bye.